that Israel used deliberately disproportionate force. Israel used deliberately disproportionate force to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. To punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population. It's also important to bear in mind that the attack on the Palestinian infrastructure, it was not arbitrary. It was very careful. It not only wanted to destroy the civilian infrastructure, but it wanted to make sure that after they withdrew, the Palestinians would not be able to rebuild and that they would continue to suffer under that blockade. So they destroyed the only operative flour mill in Gaza. They destroyed 22 of the 28 cement factories in Gaza. They destroyed the electrical grid and the water and sewage systems, because as they withdrew, they understood that they were going to have to maintain the blockade to finally depose Hamas, and the only way to make that blockade really hurt was to make sure that they can't rebuild all the civilian infrastructure that was destroyed. And that basically leads us to phase 2 of this plan by Israel, which is after Israel withdrew from Gaza for the next year, from January 2009 until the end of May 2010, they maintained this brutal siege on Gaza. All the human rights organizations agreed. There was no dispute whatsoever that the people of Gaza were suffering a humanitarian crisis. It was the opinion of the International Committee of the Red Cross. It was the opinion of the UN organizations operating in Gaza. Unemployment by May 2010, it stood at 40%. It was the highest unemployment recorded anywhere in the world. 90% of the water in Gaza was contaminated. 10% of the people were suffering from malnutrition. And it was those conditions and the acquiescence, and even more than acquiescence, the support of the international community that drove many people finally to try to break the blockade in various ways, including the flotillas. We should make one point, or I would want to make one point. Even if it were true that there was no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, Israel still had no right to lay siege to it. Palestinians have a right not just to a humanitarian minimum, but they have a right, like everybody else in the world, to live a decent life. And so we should accept this kind of terminology such that if there is no humanitarian crisis, then the siege is legitimate. No. Israel has only one right, and that right is to pack up its bags and leave. Israel claimed, when it tried to prevent banned the flotilla from entering Gaza. It claimed it had a right to do so, and it starts citing all of these covenants from international law. But the essence is so transparently clear, any person who doesn't have a graduate degree can understand it. The principle is, if the blockade is illegal, and all the humanitarian organizations said, in the words of Amnesty, the blockade is a flagrant violation of international law. You obviously do not have a right to impose or preserve something or maintain a practice which itself is illegal. It's a basic principle of law. It has a very fancy Latin term, but the translation just is, you can't derive a right from a wrong. If the act itself is wrong, then you can't have a right to enforce the wrong. If the blockade is illegal, then you don't have a right to maintain the blockade. And all international organizations agreed. The blockade was a form of collective punishment, as Israel itself acknowledged, calling it a form of economic warfare, and therefore they had no right to maintain the blockade. Leaving aside the fact that the blockade was never about trying to prevent weapons from entering Gaza, and Israel has never even made the claim that there were weapons on that boat or those boats which were headed for Gaza. What I want to do now is look at what happened during that attack, in particular on the Mavi Marmara, the lead ship, which had about 500 passengers on it, and which at the end, about 9, or including a person who was injured that passed away, 10 were killed, and about 40 people were injured. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened, and I spent the last couple of weeks going through a mountain of reportage, speculation, reports, trying to make sense of what happened. Before I try to make sense of it, I would want to just emphasize the preliminary point, which is what actually happened on the boat is the most trivial aspect of the massacre or the bloodbath on the Mavi Marmara. The essence is Israel had no right in the first place to board that boat. And the people on that boat had every right to direct themselves to relieving the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But of course, there is a certain amount of curiosity. What did happen? I'm sure many of you have watched on YouTube the various videos of what happened on the Mavi Marmara, trying to make sense of it. And so, this evening, I'm going to try, at least in a preliminary fashion, to make sense of it. The first question is, why did Israel resort to a violent commando raid in its attack on the Mavi Marmara? It was widely acknowledged that if they wanted to stop the boat, they had many non-violent options. They could have disabled the rudder on the boat. They could have disabled the propeller on the boat.